Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you all here. This is the Institute for Land Warfare's Contemporary Military Forum for Delivering Force Modernization. So if that's not what you wanted to hear about, you'll have 30 seconds before we lock the doors. I'm Lieutenant General Retired Sean McFarland, one of AUSA's Institute for Land Warfare's Senior Fellows. And as your professional association, what we try to do is to provide forums like this to expand the knowledge base of our professionals and those who support it, like yourselves. It's one of 10 professional forums that we're doing during this convention, and we do these year-round to amplify the Army's narrative and to reinforce AUSA's mission, which is to be the voice for the Army and support for the soldier. And of course, we can't do that alone. Paid announcement here. We rely on a strong membership base to do that. For those of you who are members of AUSA, thank you. For those of you who are not, you can still have time to join. It's in booth 307 in Hall A, and we'd be pleased if you did so. So today's topic, as I said, is delivering force modernization. And we're very honored to have a distinguished panel with us here today. We have Dr. Bruce Jetty, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. General Mike Murray, Commanding General of U.S. Army Futures Command. Dr. Nadia Shadlow, former Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy and Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Gwen Shotwell, President and Chief Operating Officer of SpaceX, and Lieutenant General Neil Thurgood, Director of Hypersonics, Directed Energy and Space for the Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technologies Office. So he wins the prize for the longest title. And I'll be your humble moderator. So the format here is we're going to start with some opening statements from our two co-chairs, General Murray and Dr. Jetty, and then we'll get to questions for our other distinguished panelists, and then some questions from the floor, which I think there are 3x5 cards circulating around, or 5x8 cards. There's some over there, and please put them in, scribble them down as you're listening, and pass them to one of the ushers circulating around. And if we expend all those questions, we have open mics, and we can go to the microphones as well. But your best bet is to put your question on a 5x8 card and pass it to the end of the aisle. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to General Mike Murray, who will talk to us about how we identify requirements for modernization.
So first of all, just echo Sean's comments and thanks to everybody, especially on a Wednesday, right? So Wednesday, the history of AUSA, you're either trying to recover from Tuesday night, you're trying to catch a flight, or as you look around, you work in the Pentagon and you're trying to avoid going back to the Pentagon, so you found something to do. So I appreciate everybody's attendance at this, and I think you've got a pretty phenomenal panel and in a long period of time, 4 questions, and so I'm going to be fairly short about this. I've set a couple panels this week, and I've mentioned the Army Modernization Strategy several times. I've been told, as of this morning, I was quoted in the newspaper, it would be out in a few days. I didn't lie, it's out. Signed by the Secretary, the Chief, and the SMA. And it really talks about modernization more holistically than we have in the past. So this is not only what we'll fight with, the material solutions, which we've talked about in the past. This is also how we'll fight. So it's the concept called multi-domain operations. And it really talks about who we are. So it's very closely linked with the Army's people strategy and how we need to grow the talent to modernize and be successful in the future. So it's out there someplace, and this is kind of my paid political announcement. It's we try very hard to make it readable. For the strategy piece of it, it's a short 9 pages long, so you can get through it pretty quickly. There's a about a 250-page implementation plan that goes along with it for use by the Army that I'm almost certain you would not want to try to read. But the strategy is out there, and I'd highly recommend you get it. And so part of what I hope will come out is, and we've been talking about this for a year, and Bruce and I, Dr. Jetty, talk often about why we're still talking about, you know, the relationship between AFC and the ASALT, in this case, the Army Acquisition Executive. And firmly, requirements belong on the AFC side, but I almost hate to even say that, because I think the thing that is happening, and it manifests itself with most evidence at the CFT level. And when I say CFT, most of you think of Ross Kaufman and Wally Rugen. When I say cross-functional team, the T is the most important part to me. And it's this relationship between, and the very solid relationship between the requirements community and the acquisition community, and often going back and forth without a clear fence in between, that I think is the most powerful thing that has happened in the last year. That would be number one. Number two would be our willingness and ability, freed up by the shackles of the senior leadership and really the Army's lawyers, to have honest and open conversations with industry about where we want to go, what we're trying to do, and have that constant dialogue back and forth. Are our requirements valid? Can these be achieved? What else would you recommend we do? And then, although you'll still see requirements documents, and there is a distinction between a requirements document and a P-spec, but the requirements documents still are way too thick, and that is more boilerplate. But if you boil it down to how we're defining requirements, in almost every case of the requirements that I've approved over the last last year, you're really talking about 3 or 4 to 5 pages of the document, and the rest of it is pretty much boilerplate. And we are trying very hard to describe how we want to, or not how, but what problems we want to solve, and then let industry innovate in terms of how they can possibly solve that problem. OTAs have helped with that, you know, and really what I'm talking about now is acquisition strategies. And just like Dr. Jetty counsels me all the time on our requirements, Dr. Jetty has been very open to me talking about acquisition strategies and the best way to get after this. But it is at all levels about teamwork. It is all levels about delivering output. I read stuff all the time that are really interesting metrics, but to be honest with you, what I'm interested in is output for our soldiers in a relatively quick fashion. And relatively quick really depends on what it is you're trying to do. And you know, at the end of the day, this is what we can provide our soldiers from a material standpoint, from a concept standpoint, and really from an organizational structure standpoint. And most people get focused on the material. I'm sure that's what we're going to concentrate on. That's fine. But this is, the Army took some bold steps a year ago or 2 years ago, really, when they came up with the concept of Army Futures Command. And it is about doing things differently. And you've heard the Chief talk about it's about winning, because in our profession, second place is not a good place to be. So this is about winning, and this is about looking at doing things differently and moving the Army into the information age, because we will not be successful if we just continue to do the same things we've always done in the past at delivering relative capability to our soldiers in a timely fashion. And the last thing I'd add that I hope you're seeing is different that we're doing, and it really came from so when you're told you're going to do something you've never been prepared for in the last 35 years, there's no formal education for what I'm doing. You tend to read different things than I've ever read, and so it wasn't America's First Battles, it wasn't T.R. Fehrenbach, it wasn't Clausewitz, it was Lean Startup was the first book I kind of picked up. And the one thing I picked up from Lean Startup was customer involvement in the development process. And so you'll hear me talk all the time about soldier-centered design. And so, for instance, on IVAS, which most of you are familiar with Microsoft, we have we're at the second formal soldier touch point next month. We have well over 5,000 hours of interaction with young soldiers, the users of the material, and the developers at Microsoft, providing almost constant feedback to the developers. So we make sure that we not only deliver a very capable piece of equipment at the end, but we deliver something that our customer, our soldiers, actually want and are capable and willing to use on a future battlefield. So with that, I think I probably talked longer than I was supposed to. I will pause there and turn it over to my good friend, Dr. Bruce Jetty.
Thanks, Mike. So I think I want to do one of the same things. First, I'd like to tell you all that being the Assistant Secretary of the Army, one of the benefits is I get executive medicine, so that means that I get to go to the back into the military medical system, and that's really useful because Mike and I tend to have to go up to Walter Reed every so often and have surgery to separate ourselves because we keep getting joined at the hip so much that we just weld together. I know there's a lot of, to tell you the truth, and we may as well put it out here. A lot of times, one of the first questions is, how are you two getting along? And so we have a little stuffed animal that we throw on the table, and if you have a controversy, you throw it out on the table, and we say we've got to deal with that. And so the controversy is how much conflict do you have? Well, we don't always agree on everything, and we don't always, we have little storming and here and there. But the truth of the matter is, the vast majority of what we're trying to do is, in fact, fully cooperate. We work together extremely effectively. I think General Murray and I have a tremendous relationship and very open communications. I've been around the Army for quite a while. I'll have my 50-year reunion from West Point coming up not too long from now, which really saddens me because I remember being a cadet out on the parade field and thinking, those guys are almost dead. And now it's going to be me. And in 50 years of being around the Army, I've seen a lot of different things go on. So let me just convey a little bit here. Requirements are the centerpiece of what we do. There's no purpose in the acquisition process, developing and producing a product, fielding a product. Remember, I have A, L, and T, so it's all the way from the tech side where I just basically do oversight through to the acquisition, through to the sustainment piece and the logistics piece. And when I look at that, I look at how we've been doing things in the past, and none of that starts unless it has a reason to exist. We don't build things for fun. We build things to make soldiers effective on the battlefield. The assessment of that soldier effectiveness on the battlefield is had been in the past based in several different places. You wanted to understand how we're going to fight. You wanted to understand what the requirement was. You had to kind of shop around. And then how well it was woven together. There was nobody whose belly button the Chief of Staff of the Army, the Secretary of the Army, could poke and say, so how are we going to fight this? Why do you need that? Why is that the right one and not this? Because as I have said on a number of occasions, none of us in the acquisition community get a commission. We don't have sales, we don't get a commission. How many we make? I remember the chief one day asked me, why are we making 5,000 robots? I said, because you said to. How many do you want? I get no profit out of the deal. And my point in making this is, in the past, those decisions were spread out. The value I have seen in AFC at this point, for me, as the head of Army acquisition writ large, is to have a partner who I can turn to for requirements, for understanding, for guidance on what they'd like to do in the path forward, and having that one place to go. So there is a significant value to what I see AFC bringing to the table. I'll tell you the second big change that I've seen in how we've tried to attack this problem. So some of you see me before because I'm an analogy guy. In the past, the requirement was written by the requirements guys. They wrote it. They did it by themselves. They had this little dark room, a couple of cigars, I guess. I don't know what went on in there. And the next thing I know, I got this document. It tells me what to do. the PM gets it, it is a handoff like this. I mean, that's how much interaction there is. And then the acquisition community goes off and builds it. And about 6 years later, we deliver it back, and of course, the guy who wrote the requirement is retired. And the new person looks at the thing that got delivered and goes, that's not what I want. And so we have this turmoil in the process that goes on. It was not a good process. The role of AFC and the acquisition, smaller A acquisition side of things, is to join together, okay? And so AFC has the role and responsibility of generating the requirements, and the acquisition community has a role and responsibility of trying to produce those turn those requirements into a product that gets fielded. And you know, it's not just producing the thing, but it's how many are we producing, on what timeline, against what budget, how do we get it into the field, how do we train people so that when they get it, we can deal with it. All those are part of this half that requires continuous interaction with this half. So the joining of the two communities through CFTs and other actions, because the CFTs focus on 31 projects, but we really talk about many, many more. So this joining process, I don't know if you're far enough away, I'm wiggling my right-hand fingers. Those are acquisition officers who are PMs, PEOs, who also have pretty much everyone. I think all of my acquisition officers have combat patches from their time in operation communities. In turn, but they have a limited amount of operational experience, usually up 6-7 years. You turn to the operational community, who end up in General Murray's side of the equation, and those people have much more operational experience, but not that much in materials. So by bringing the people who have the materials expertise and an ability to communicate across the boundaries into the operational view, and the operational community who may have at the very beginning not had much material insight, but now the organization understands why acquisition behaves the way it does sometimes. And sometimes they come up and say, well, you know, like General Murray said, you know, we find things we do more out of habit than we do out of requirement. And so we're identifying and raising some of those things up as well. So this cross-boundary cooperative nature, interaction, are there tussles occasionally? Sure. But you know, in the big philosophical storming, forming, and norming, we're well into the forming and norming phase of things. We still have a tornado or thunderstorm roll by every so often. General Murray and I'll get involved if we need to, but many of them are resolved even before they end up at our level. Because of that, I think that we're starting to see other integrated discussions. We are co-chairs on the EEPEG. And this issue, when you create a new organization, there's always boundaries, because somebody was doing something all the time before. Now that there's two organizations that are constructed somewhat differently, or at least one of them is reconstructed, there's a determination of where the boundaries are. What are you responsible to do? What am I responsible to do? Well, I used to do that. Yeah, but it was really my responsibility. Well, are you going to take the job? Yes. Okay. Well, here it is. Now how does that change my job? Some of that are things that we wrestled through. Where one of them, for example, is on the EEPEG. It was always just the ASALT that sat up there. Now, General Murray and I are co-chairs of the EEPEG. The person who's responsible for the operational value of a given system in the big context of warfighting now and into the future is sitting next to the person who's responsible to make sure that the procurement side of the Army gets it accomplished and gets it to the field on the time schedule is demanded of us, et cetera, et cetera. So now when something comes to the EEPEG for funding, the first place I turn is, do we need it? Do you want it? Is it operationally relevant? Does it fit your plan? And General Murray's been very good about turning to me and saying, okay, if we cancel this, what's the impact on businesses? What's the impact on this gap we may have in our technology, or a gap we may have in a production rate? Or what about what's the recoverable funds we can get out of this so we can put it in something else? This cooperative effort has, I think it certainly has yielded us an ability to restructure some of our programs that we, back to the out of habit comment. Out of habit, we funded a lot of programs. When the operational side took a hard look at many of them, they said, I don't know if we need this anymore. I think we need something different that should cover it, but not this, because it doesn't cover new things that are emerging. So by taking that really critical look at what we were doing operationally and where we should be going, talking to the technical material side of the community on what's possible now, near, mid, and far term, and then making a new assessment, we've freed up, as the Secretary said yesterday in his talk, quite a large sum of money. I'm not going to quote it because I don't want to get it wrong. Which is going towards newer concepts and programs. It's funny, I wrote down IVAS as sort of my example. I just was out in Seattle last week, took a look at the program, and it's a great example of this linkage between the two of us. You have the PM, the PEO, the CFT lead, some of the CFT personnel. We even have offices in the building right there where they're doing the development with the vendor. And they're doing spirals on a weekly basis. They're doing significant testing on a monthly basis. We've got the soldier touch points in here. And they're integrating it in. And this is the development phase. We'll get to a point where we're going to go towards the production phase, and we'll mod the relationship, and maybe we'll spin back off, version 2.0. But right now, you can see this close interaction, because people ask for something operationally. It can't be done technically, or it can't be done economically, and we start managing that jointly, and we're having, I think, some better outcomes. We had a significant number of programs that were challenged about 18 months ago. I think through a number of this, we're down to, frankly, to tell you the truth, I have one program on my MDAPs that I have to follow really closely, and it has to do with the fact that I'm waiting for testing. It's not that I have a problem with the program. I just can't confirm that there's no problem with the program until there's testing accomplished. That's the type of thing that we're getting as a result of this close interaction. So I hope that's been useful and helpful in discussing how these things are coming about.
Okay, well, thanks for that, gentlemen. That was a great kickoff for the panel. I think first question we'll give to Nadia, and the question for you would be, how will the Army's modernization efforts support our national security strategy?
Okay, thanks, John. I think there are four ways to think about answering that question, and in some ways it's a recap of what Dr. Jetty and General Murray have talked about. Looking back, if you're talking from the future point in a couple of years, I think there'll be four measures of the success of the Army modernization community in addressing what the national security strategy talked about, which was essentially that we need to pay more attention to the great power competition that's underway. First, we will ask, have you identified and successfully communicated the strategic problems facing the United States and the Army specifically? Does industry understand what the Army is facing, and more broadly, the American people? You want to be able to answer that question. Second, looking back, have you developed the innovative operational concepts required to fight and win across this landscape? Or to put it more clearly, what military problems are you going to face? Because you're not modernizing for the sake of modernizing. You're modernizing to address those problems and solve them and win. Third has Army Futures Command specifically, but also the broader modernization community, driven change so that new technologies can be integrated into the force quickly. Speed is a measure of power today. And our, in terms of the United States, we're not doing that well. Speed and agility are now requirements. It's an undervalued measure of power. Usually we talk about economic power, military power in terms of what we have on the kinetic side. But speed is important, and we'll look back, and that question has to be answered positively. And fourth, have we encouraged the right incentives at the tactical level to implement what General Murray has talked about in terms of multi-domain operations at the tactical level, combined arms at that level? Can soldiers use the technologies effectively? Can they adapt them as needed on the field? So I think we'll look back, and we want to be able to answer those four questions positively as a measure of how the community has done to meet the national security strategy requirements. Thanks.
Thanks, Nadia. And for Gwen, a question. What can the Army learn from industry regarding innovation and rapid development?
So let me do a couple of very quick remarks. SpaceX is new to this forum and to this service, so I'm pleased, I was very pleased to be invited, and I'm honored to be up on this panel with the heroes that are sitting up here with me. I'm not going to do an advertisement, but in order to give context to my response, I just want to say briefly what SpaceX is about. We were founded 17 years ago to build space transportation systems, which are rockets and spaceships, that are reliable enough and are capable enough and are low cost enough, and I always put low cost in parentheses because rockets and spaceships are still expensive, that could ultimately carry people to live on other planets. And 17 years ago, that sounded crazy. Now it sounds bold and audacious. So one of the key elements of being able to move large cargo and people to distant locations, or to not so distant locations, but in rapid order, is to have these systems be reusable. Right now, rockets, after their use, they get tossed in the ocean or they fall in the ocean. I think that's a bad learning experience. You don't get to see that capability after its mission. You're polluting the oceans, and it just seems like a waste of money. So one of the key features of what we're trying to do is make our systems reusable. And I would like to roll a video and then talk very briefly about the journey that we took to make our systems reusable. So if you could roll this video. This is a little bit of commentary for the morning. point of that video is to show, by the way, not to show failures. Our primary missions, this kind of behavior is not acceptable. However, developing technologies to be able to land rockets after it's been in hypersonic space was incredibly important to us. And we used those rockets. We first put the second stage into orbit, put the payload, the primary mission, into orbit, and then we developed, we experimented with that first stage. Instead of just on purpose tossing it in the ocean, we would guide it back and ultimately guide it back in 2015 to land on land and also land on the drone ship in the water. And the key really was to rapidly learn, test fast, fail early, to ultimately get it right. And we've had very few mishaps on our landings since that first one in 2015. So you do want to fail early on development. You don't want to fail on your operational missions. You want to win on your operational missions. But it's important to test out and push the envelope during development so you know what your margins are, you know your weak points, and you can ultimately continue to spin your technology.
Thanks, Gwen. And then a question for Neil Thurgood is, how's the Army partnering with industry to rapidly modernize in critical technologies like space?
Great, thanks. So the visions that are happening at that side of the table get executed on this side of the table. And so I would just tell you that the partnership that's happening across the Army in terms of the synchronization between the Futures Command and the ASALT community is really, really strong and really developing quite quickly. In the case where you're trying to execute prototyping fast, right? Prototyping is different than demonstrations. Demonstrations are how you try to develop technology. Prototyping is giving things to soldiers for a combat outcome. And so in the Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technologies Office, we're streamlined and designed and given the authorities to execute prototyping for combat outcomes. And so I think one of the things that helps us in our partnership with industry is a fundamental understanding that we're not trying to develop technology over time. We're trying to take technology and innovatively apply that technology differently. In our business, it happens in kind of three domains with industry. So in the hypersonic domain, we are trying to build an industrial base as we take this technology that was developed by our great S&T community, rapidly remove it from the S&T community, put it into a commercial industrial base that doesn't exist for that kind of technology. And how you do that kind of work is a little bit different than how you do directed energy work, which is where you try to exercise an existing industrial base for a rapid outcome. So how you execute and design an organization and a culture and a focus to use an existing industrial base for an outcome very quickly is a little bit different than how you use and develop a base industrial capability that doesn't currently exist in a nation. And then the third piece of that is there's a whole set of our industrial base that I would put is out there exercising. It might be in a commercial marketplace. It might be in a university lab environment. It's the discovery of the industrial base, right? So how do we discover and technologies that are out there that we can innovatively use quickly? And so in order to get that outcome, whether we're trying to take something from the S&T committee and build an industrial base, whether we're trying to use an existing industrial capability or we're trying to discover an industrial capability, the focus that you need to do that, and the authorities you need to do that are a little bit different. And under this domain of the Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technologies Office, we've been given the authority from our senior leaders to do those three types of activities. And when you have the clarity that you saw, and you heard earlier from our leaders, the clarity you saw from our secretary, and then the clarity that our chief gives us, and it was mentioned by General Murray, when they talk about winning matters, there's a time relevant construct that goes with winning matters. You can't win the fight you need to be in today, tomorrow. You have to win that fight today. So it gets to the time constraints that are associated with the outcomes that we desire. So when we talk about winning, it is a time-relevant construct, and we have to accelerate our processes. And so in our office, and you hear these words used all the time, we have to bridge an industrial process, a relatively bureaucratic process, a rule-driven set of processes in a new way. And so with the authorities that we've been given from our leadership, we can reach out and build industrial bases, we can use existing industrial bases, and we discover industrial bases. Industrial capabilities are out there. Those combination of things allow us to move rapidly with soldier touch points, and General Murray uses the term soldier-centered design, soldier touch points that get a soldier quickly into this prototyping aspect. Before we go into the long process, in the effective process, even though it's long, to produce thousands of these things, or whatever the thing is for an Army. And whether we go to an increment 1 and an increment 2 is totally different, or whether increment 1 is modified, then that process that our programs and records office, our PEO structures use, can become effective. And so when you focus the structure, you focus the culture, and you focus the resources, then you get the outcomes you want when you partner those outcomes with our industry partners. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Neil. So back to General Murray. Futures Command was designed to cut the red tape of modernization. Please talk about how you're working with other organizations like TRADOC and others to develop concepts across all of .mil PF, and then the follow-on example is given. Are we simply modernizing current formations as they are, or are we reorganizing organizations and echelons to exploit new technologies?
So I see two different questions there, Sean. So the red tape piece of it is, and I don't mean this in a bad way. So when the Army decided to stand up Army Futures Command, the FAR didn't magically disappear. JSIS didn't magically disappear. DoD 5000 didn't magically disappear. So it's not really cutting through the red tape, and I do think that we self-limited ourselves and used a lot of that as an excuse rather than an enabler. So it's really, how do you take existing processes like Neil was talking about that have proven very effective in the past when you're talking about building thousands of something, and really accelerate through that process. And so at least on the requirement side, and I'll let Bruce follow up on the acquisition side, I mean, we have taken a requirements process that was taking us 3 to 5 years just to get the requirement approved by senior leaders. And I can't think of a case over the last year that took more than 6 months. And so we have really streamlined the requirements process. And then I'm sure Bruce will talk about the congressional authorities we've been given in terms of 804, 806 OTAs, and how that's really helping accelerate, once we do get a material decision, that's the way we're going to go. The cross.mil PF work is really interesting, and Bruce talked about when you stand up a new organization, you automatically cross boundaries into things that people thought they were responsible for. So the relationship I have with Paul Funk and part of Army Futures Command are the combat developers at each of the centers of excellence, which was historically owned by TRADOC. That is still a shared resource between TRADOC and although they belong to Army Futures Command. And we rely very, very heavily on the center commanders to figure out the priorities, which Paul and I lay out for them pretty clearly in terms of where their priorities lie. We have taken the approach, and it was mentioned earlier, in terms of materials got to match a need, and that's the beauty of the most recent NDS that then Secretary Mattis signed out, is it's very clear about what we should be developing concepts and organizational structures and material to support. And so we believe we are well grounded in the NDS. So I hope that's a check mark when we get there. But the whole .mil PF, and we really have not done a good job. We've been developing material for material's sake for a long time. And so in many ways, the 31 signature systems plus, I would almost call them 34 now with the three things that Neil Thorogood is focused on, right now are driving change in the Army across doctrine, and that's we're not to the doctrine point yet, but definitely the concepts of multi-domain operations. They're driving installation investments in terms of how we're investing in installations, different ranges, different facilities. They are beginning to drive the leader development. Most often, armies don't teach at their schools concepts. We're beginning to talk multi-domain operations as a concept in our schools. So from a leader development standpoint, it's starting to drive change in the Army. The synchronization of all that, I've got a decision matrix, a spreadsheet that will make your eyes water in terms of all the things that have to happen in time to make sure that we're doing that. And we're beginning to look at things more as a system of systems approach. And the example I use all the time is one of the things we're working on, it's still an S&T effort, is a cannon that shoots 1,000 miles. Unbelievable maybe, but that's kind of what we're working on in an S&T arena. But if I can't see 1,000 miles, if I can't pass targeting data 1,000 miles over a reliable network, if I can't do battlefield damage assessment, from 1,000 miles away, then that's a really cool capability, but it's not very relevant. And so looking at this from a systems to systems standpoint, and not only across .mil PF, and I mentioned teamwork is one of the things we're working on. This will take a team of not only TRADOC and Army Futures Command and ASALT to make sure that we have everything covered in terms of how the material that we're working on is really driving the Army forward. We are looking at different organizational structures. We're experimenting right now with a multi-domain task force that's been in existence for a couple years and supporting U.S. Army Pacific and Admiral Davison and Indo-PACOM. We have just activated one in Europe in support of Chris Cavoli in U.S. Army Europe, and ultimately Todd Walters in EUCOM. And we will probably most likely stand up a second in Indo-PACOM for that theater. And the whole purpose of those organizational structures, whether they exist on a future table of organization equipment in the future or not, is to begin to experiment in the impacts of what we're doing in terms of material concepts on organizational structures. And we are beginning to look very, very hard at how we reorganize the Army, and it's probably going to be echelon responsibilities and echelon capabilities as opposed to the modular designs that the Army is organized under today.
Did you want anything to that, Bruce?
Well, the thing I would say is we are wrestling with the fact that FAR doesn't change. Quite a number of our regulations and DoD's DoD instructions don't change. I will say that OSD it did cause me a little fear when OSD said we're going to rewrite the 5,000 because to make it more efficient. Every time in my past that they said we're going to rewrite the 5,000 so that it's more efficient, it got thicker by a factor of 2 or 3 each evolution. This time, Honorable Lord has made a real focus of trying to make it much more manageable, and I think that some of the things she's doing actually will make it a much more useful document. However, it doesn't take away a lot of the things that keep us integrated. I mean, it's not just the acquisition community sits there and produces a product and leaves it at the loading dock and tells the acquisition community or tells the operational community, there it is, we're done. We have to coordinate that big horrible chart that I'm sure all of you have seen with all the 8,000 boxes on there. So many of those boxes are actually pretty useful and necessary. Things like, you just gave me a new vehicle. How does that fit in my current motor pool? Is the gun tube long enough that now I can't put them in rows that close together and therefore I can't have as many rows in my motor pool? Those are other things that are kind of this cross between, as General Murray was saying, General Funk has to figure out what his facilities look like. General Murray's got to figure out what the operational value of putting the systems in place are. We have to figure out are we going to have to put money into the budget for actually modifying the facilities that General Funk owns in order to be able to accommodate the operational capabilities in a full systems approach? So it's sometimes not so simple as an issue as just saying, well, I want to modify a requirement. 804 has given us a lot of flexibility to get at what General Thurgood was saying, you know, and General Murray has said, how can we get things done? How can we cut past certain things that might be in the way? I think what they're really doing, 804s and OTAs, is letting us get to the point that that Gwen was really focusing on. Get to a solution early that you can employ. And, you know, fits Nadia's point about being operationally relevant for the National Defense Strategy, and get it into the hands of the soldiers early. But don't forget that you have to go back and clean up the battlefield if you've got things like motor pool sizes or new tool kits that you need or all these other things to make sure that it can be sustained in the field.
Thanks. Well, and I'll just follow up with another question for you, since we're talking about the impact of modernization. And this is a question that deals with how will the Army mitigate the risks to readiness and avoid creating a culture of haves and have-nots as we build an MDO force with all these high-cost material solutions over extended implementation timelines.
Yeah, that's so haves, have-nots. I mean, I try to stay away from haves. You know, haves and maybe haves better might be a good way of looking. But you know, so I grew up in the Army a long time ago, and I grew up in an ALO 4 unit. And so while Sean McFarland was on the GDP in Germany with M1 tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, I was sitting at Fort Carson with M60A3s and 113s. The division commander was a man named Denny Reimer. The 3 brigade commanders were Tom Schwartz, Tom Carter, and Wes Clark. And so the leader development piece of it, you know, really weren't impacted with being an ALO 4 unit. It wasn't that the 4th Infantry Division was any less valuable than the 11th ACR or the 1st Armored Division or anybody else. It takes time to field equipment. So we've got 20 Armored Brigade combat teams in the United States Army, if you count everything in pre-position stocks. At best, even with increased funding, at best, we'll be able to modernize 1 brigade a year. So it's going to take me 20 years, and we've said this before, hopefully not with the same technology in the 20th one as the first one, but regardless, it's going to take 20 years. So really what we're focused on is not haves and have-nots. It's getting the newest and most capable equipment into the units that need it first. And so there was also this thing back when I was growing up called a Forces 4 document. And when I was in the 1st Cavalry Division, we were on, you know, we call it pass charts now, but we knew that if something happened in CENTCOM or something happened in PACOM, in Korea specifically, we would be one of the first ones to go. And so that's really what we're trying to do. Under the construct of the National Defense Strategy, you have contact, blunt, and surge forces. But the units that will be in contact first, regardless of the compo, whether that's regular Army, National Guard, or U.S. Army Reserve, gets the very best equipment first. And then there will be, obviously, a long period of time as we continue to field new equipment across the rest of the Army.
And another, I mean, I might also add the concept of the Army deters as a whole by being prepared along a continuum of conflict. And so different parts of the Army play a role in that across the range, sort of the campaigning concept.
And that kind of leads to another question for perhaps you, Nadia, which is, you know, how do we get these requirements across the river to Capitol Hill and get the funding necessary? And please, Dr. Jetty or anybody else who wants to join in on that, more than welcome.
Yeah, I think really to the point I made, the first point earlier, it's explaining, you know, with clarity the nature of the threats and the problems. Don't assume that the Hill just knows that. I mean, it's a constant discussion of the problems, of the threats that are being faced, briefings. You know, there's a lot of information out there. Not all of it's classified. You know, you use all of that to explain what's necessary and the imperative of it. So.
And just presence matters, and so and I think I said this in this forum up front. So the cross-functional teams, and when I say that, it was the director and his associated PM or PEO, in some cases both the PM and PEO. We're well over 550 trips to the Hill since 1 January. So transparency with Congress, informing Congress, letting them know where your investments are, why you're investing, where you're investing, is just incredibly important. I mean, they are they write the checks for not just the Army, but for DOD writ large, and so they obviously have a huge stake, and we try to keep them as up to date, as informed, not only what we're doing, but why we're doing what we're doing as we possibly can.
So this is probably for Gwen, and I'll include General Thurgood in this too. And this is how to, well, not that SpaceX is a small business, but how do small and innovative businesses with partial or contributing solutions to complex requirements become part of the solution, and what's the process to engage companies that are out there with answers to our questions? And I know you've been involved with NASA a lot on that side, and I'm sure some of those lessons would carry over to DOD, right?
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, we also serve the Air Force and national security
Right,
space needs as
absolutely.
well, right?
Right.
So,
We didn't want to mention the Air Force, but
sorry. I'm not savvy enough to know about the rivalries there.
they also serve. It's okay. No, that's all right.
The method by which you contract or partner with organizations like SpaceX, we are not a small business, but we started out as a small business, and how you contract with us is absolutely key. I think one of our most successful programs was called the COTS program, Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program. That was an Other Transaction Authority award that we were given in 2006, and the sole purpose of that award was to build a capability that could berth with the International Space Station and transfer cargo and science, both to the station and then return that precious science back to Earth. It started out as a $278 million program. Requirements increased a little bit. Ultimately, it was $406 million program. And what happened for that $406 million worth of government investment? We got Falcon 9 to orbit in that time frame. We built the Dragon spaceship, which has carried 18 times cargo to the International Space Station and back. For $406 million, I think that was some of the best money ever spent by NASA in that time frame. By the way, we put up, I think by the time we matured the capability, we matched that 406 and exceeded it. Probably we spent $800 to $1 billion in that time frame getting Falcon 9 working correctly and Dragon to the International Space Station. So I think partnering with industries that want to build a similar capability to what you're looking for, help them a little bit. Do a little bit of investment on the development side, but be the market out the back end. NASA is our single largest customer now. I think we're giving them great value for the initial investment dollars that they put into development, and we're doing a great job for them getting critical cargo and science to the International Space Station.
Thanks, Gwen. And General Thurgood, if you could talk a little bit about how what you're doing with rapid prototyping, with industry, with new processes like additive manufacturing and others, to invest in that to assist our modernization.
Yeah, thanks. So I think to pile on with Gwen, it's in the third, earlier I talked about, building industrial bases, using existing industrial bases, and discovering industrial bases, right? Discovering innovative ideas. One of the tools we use for that, and one of the things you hear often from industry, is we don't know how to reach to you, right? We have this really good idea, but you don't, in an industrial-based system, we don't have a requirement, but it really is a good idea. That's something a soldier could use. And so just recently, we held an innovation day. We called it an innovation day. And that was on the 17th of September. We're going to do it twice a year, and we team across the entire material enterprise inside the department, right? So we bring in the S&T community, we bring the CFTs in, we bring the PEOs in, We bring all the key players in. And the one we held in 17 September, we literally sent a notice out to industry. If you have a good idea that you think is relevant for a warfighter, we'd like to know about that idea. And we had 182 respondents. Of the 182, and just in a white paper, no proposals. You send us a 5-page white paper, tell us what your idea is, and if we think it has relevance to what we're trying to accomplish in a modernization strategy that fits the timeline where winning matters, then we'll invite you back. And so we invited back 42 companies. I literally had a panel, just like a Shark Tank, like you'd see on TV. Each company had 30 minutes. Come in and present your idea. We had large companies come in, and we had companies with literally 4 people. 100% of the company came to the presentation. And of that 42, we selected and are moving forward with about 12 of 13 of those companies. And so we have to the government has to create an invitation to get to innovation. The normal process of sending out, getting a requirement document, sending out an RFP is not necessarily going to churn the innovation at the speed which we need to if we want to keep ourselves relevant on the battle space. And then the second part of that is, as we build prototypes, we're not trying to build that perfect. It's called an experiment and a prototype for a reason. It's not the final solution. It's the start point to see if the technical thing that we're trying to produce will provide value to the combat soldier. If it doesn't provide value, we don't want to have a program that's on the path to build a lot of these. We want a program that says, let's build it and let's try it, see if it does what it's supposed to do, and that's my responsibility. And then we give it over to a program of record who can then go through a much more deliberate process to get out to build thousands of these for units across all the components that General Murray talked about. As we build these new ideas, you also have to consider the construct of how are you going to actually produce from a prototype state to a productionized state, right? The things you do to make a prototype are not necessarily things you do to make a productionized version of this thing that's repeatable. And so then we start bringing in the ideas of additive manufacturing, right? How do I take something from a lab or something from one of our industry partners' IR&D labs, and they do a great job of making one of a thing. The labs don't necessarily do a great job of making tens of things. And so I don't think we're in a position anymore where we can buy a piece of equipment and think we're going to keep that unchanged for the next 20 years. I think that construct is behind us. How do you change that construct, and how do you give a soldier on the battle space the ability to adapt a weapon or a weapons platform or a component of a weapons platform quickly? You manufacture at the point of origin, right? You don't manufacture someplace else. And so the techniques that the industrial base is using and developing in the universities, in our industrial base, to manufacture parts forward. So instead of buying a lifetime buy of bolts, maybe what I do is buy a supply of additive manufacturing machines and make bolts as I need them in the battle space. Now, clearly there are some things that you can't do that with, right? You're not necessarily going to make a rotor blade for a helicopter in an additive manufacturing machine. But a lot of things we do that are pretty common, that are used across a large pieces of equipment, a large span of domains in our Army, we can think about how we support them differently. And the techniques that are being developed, additive manufacturing, adding AI to that, machine learning to that, we can actually change the dynamics of how we support our soldiers in the field.
Thanks, Neil. And Dr. Chetty, if you could talk a little bit about how our initiatives to develop our domestic supply chain and industrial base that you're working on.
So this is actually a really timely point to bring up, and Neil began touching on this. In fact, just right before we came in here, General Murray and I were talking about the industrial base. We have a problem with the industrial base, particularly for the defense industry. My problem in my assessment is that the industrial base is in fact that, an industrial base that, you know, you can think of large smoking cauldrons of steel type things. And they're that way because that's what we drove them to. We need to re-examine our industrial base. The first point is the industrial base we have right now has some gaps in it because we haven't been producing large equipment systems in a long time. We haven't employed some of the technical capabilities that we used to have a lot of alacrity with, and now we're developing our own system for welders. We're teaching welders because there's not in college. Everybody's trying to go to college, and nobody's trying to go to trade schools, even though tradesmen often make more than people in college, and that's before they start paying off their college loans. So we've got in the country generally a shortcoming of skilled craftsmen, and it takes people, even if they're operating equipment, to be able to understand how to convert the science and technologies of just welding into something that actually produces a vehicle that's able to hold itself together particularly under the stressful conditions we require of it. So my first piece is I think that we have to take a broad look at the industrial base we use, particularly for the heavy technologies, and then make a determination as to how we might support them in their development of the workforce that they need. A second piece to this is we need to take a look at what we're trying to do with this industrial base. So we have just put out the Secretary announced a policy for advanced manufacturing. Notice I said advanced, not additive, okay? Because every time somebody says if we could just have found a different letter than A, I think we would have been better off. Because they see added added, it must be additive manufacturing, advanced manufacturing. This includes printing, but you know, printing a bolt doesn't mean it's a bolt, nor will it withstand the stresses and strains of a bolt. So there's also subtractive manufacturing, a little bit more common in our minds, so we dismiss it as actually a component of this. There's conformal manufacturing. I was up at the University of Chicago taking a look at a machine that they have that takes, you stick a plate in there of metal, and you program it, and it will bend that thing into any shape you want. It's a very cool looking machine, but you definitely want to stand back. We've got people who've come in with casting, doing castings by additive manufacturing combined with some other techniques. Pretty much all of the different methodologies, we've got these advanced technologies that are there. And we've got to have the industrial base begin to look at how they get those pieces integrated into how they do business, both from the design phase. There are some rocket engines we've recently been shown by small vendors. You can't machine it. You can't create the engine unless you're doing advanced manufacturing. But because you're doing advanced manufacturing, that engine outperforms any prior engines because you can tailor it so carefully. So we have to start at the design phase, consider the advanced manufacturing capabilities you bring to the table, consider how we're going to employ those in the industrial base so that it's part of our manufacturing methodologies, make sure we've got a workforce that can work that, then come back to the point of how do we sustain things if we're going to evolve the systems. If I've got 1.0 and 2.0 is not going to look exactly like 1.0, it may be a derivation of 1.0 with new capabilities injected into it, or it may be a totally new system. If I'm going to remain a commercial competitor, I've got to be able to produce 1.0 and then go to 2.0 and then go to 3.0. Chevy does it, Ford does it, Toyota does it. How come we in the defense industry have not designed our production capabilities to be able to accommodate that type of change? They do it on an annual basis. I'm looking for 5 years. And then how do I sustain it? I will tell you I have transmissions probably in a warehouse. I don't know this for sure, but I'll buy any of you a cup of coffee if you want to put it up, because it'd probably, given the count here, I probably have the next 3 years worth of coffees covered if I needed it. We've got transmissions that were the original transmissions put in M113s in some warehouse someplace. Why? Because we didn't use them up, but we went on to the next transmission. But our methodology is, in the industrial age approach, you buy the transmissions so you have the supply of transmissions in case you need to replace the transmissions, particularly if there's a conflict. We can't afford that. We need to find ways to be more agile in our sustainment, and that only starts, that'll only work if we start back here in the front end, thinking about all the ways to inject the new technologies into the industrial process, not just what the new doohickey is.
Thanks, Bruce.
Sean, I just want
go
to
ahead,
add one point in terms of the national security strategy had a concept in it called the National Security Innovation Base, which was an effort to capture many of you in this room are part of that base. Gwen is part of that base. What are the components that you need to sustain innovation and think about that,
Right.
more broadly?
Right, absolutely. I'm going to ask Mike and Gwen, General Murray and Gwen, to talk a little bit about partnering with academia. And we'll start with you, Mike, on what you're doing in Futures Command, and then Gwen, how do you partner with academia at SpaceX?
So it's, and the Army's got a long history of partnering with academia, and I've forgotten the exact number. It's 200 plus universities that we invest with in terms of research, primarily at the basic and applied research level is where most of the investment was and still currently is. But what I found in the short year I've been in places, there was always a lack of focus. And so it's one of those metrics that's interesting, 200 plus universities, $12 billion over the FIDEP, and that's probably not the exact right number, but it's not far off. Then I started asking, so what's the output? I mean, what are we getting back in return? Because in my mind, and maybe I'm just naive, it should be a two-way street. If we're going to invest resources into research in a university, we should be getting something back in return. And so what we've tried over the last year is to really, and there's a lot of laws and policies and congressional interest in where we're investing dollars. But the best we can to focus our investments with a clear purpose in mind, with a clear problem we're trying to solve. And we've begun to group universities into different types of categories. And we have a category called our strategic partners. So for instance, a significant amount of money going into Carnegie Mellon for artificial intelligence, and that's where the Army's Artificial Intelligence Task Force is located. The University of Texas in Austin, I gave them what is a pretty simple problem to state, a pretty hard problem to solve, and that was, those of you in uniform would understand this, probably the most dangerous thing a soldier would ever do on a near-peer competitive battlefield is breach a complex mine wire tank ditch obstacle. And I just told the University of Texas, we want you to show me how to do that completely autonomously, so you never have to send a soldier into probably the most dangerous place on the battlefield. And then we just recently broke ground in the George H.W. Bush Combat Development Center at Texas A&M. And you think politics are bad in this town, wait till you start dealing with Texas A&M and University of Texas. We have Focus M working with Neil Thorogood on hypersonics and really hypersonic testing, directed energy testing. And so I do think and I do think we'll get some utility out of those universities, but I really think understanding what's most important and what you get back from that investment of resources. And much like Gwen was talking about, it is not just the Army investing. Between the state of Texas and the two universities, it's close to a $200 million investment into those facilities.
So we don't set out to work with any particular organization. We have problems, we encounter problems, or we know there's some tech maturation that we need to do, and we see whether we can do it better or whether there's an entity out there that can do it better. And better means faster. Speed is everything in today's world. And if universities work on a very competitively fast pace, then we will work with them. They haven't historically worked incredibly quickly. They are a great way to develop technology. They tend to have relatively lean teams, but you got to make sure there's no friction in the system, which the overhead can.
You know, if I could add another piece to this, and so there are lots of universities out there. There are certain universities that have specific skill sets that are better than other places, and within Army Futures Command, you would notice the old RDECOM, now Combat Development Capability, have a number of labs, and so 26,000 people in Army Futures Command. We have all the Army scientists, all the Army engineers, and growing that base, and so we can keep our labs viable. We will often make universities or investments in universities. That's where we recruit next generation scientists and engineers as well.
In fact, I think we work mostly with universities by hiring their students as interns in the summer, actually. We hire a lot of interns.
And then stealing them from academia.
We've talked a lot about modernization. Have several questions about sustainment as we have 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 in the force at the same time. And the old transmissions sitting in the warehouse. How do we divest ourselves of the old and make room for the new in a very dynamic modernization process? And I'll throw that over to Dr. Jetty.
So I think there's two pieces to that. The first one is let me tell you about what we're doing with divesting. Oddly enough, there's a fair amount of money that gets spent in just warehousing costs. If I don't need it anymore and I get it out of the warehouse, I don't need to do the warehousing. If I don't do the warehousing, I'm not paying a warehousing bill. So General Perna and I, the AMC commander, have recently put together something called T2S, which is Transition to Sustainment, with over 600 programs that are currently in the hands or have been in hands, and this can be a full system or it can be components of a system. We went through and scrubbed more than 1,200 items in production to determine which ones ought to be transitioned to sustainment. In other words, we're not making any changes. There's no modification work orders to be done on them. There's no engineering change proposals on the table. Basically, the item is done. It works. It's in the field. We got to maintain it. We may rebuild it, but we're not doing any significant changes to it. Those type of items, it used to be that we were doing it, well, so many years later, we're going to do this. We're going to transition to sustainment. What always happened was we'd get to that transition point and then go, well, you do know we're going to do this change next. Well, the change concept, the baselines for the equipment is always maintained in the PEO structure because they're the ones responsible for the next version and any modifications to the existing versions. The sustainment side of the house is set on the baseline that they're handed, and then they keep that maintained. So because we had a slow process of making a decision to actually transition something to sustainment, we just wait until we ran into this timeline, and then we'd make a decision, and what the decision 9 out of 10 times was, well, it's not ready for transition. Instead, what we've gone back and done is taken a totally different approach, which is let's determine what the characteristics are of a system to move it into sustainment, and then decide when we do so. So it's not time-based anymore, it's performance-based. In the process of doing that, we reviewed 1,200 programs. In the process of doing the 1,200 programs reviewed, we're transitioning over 600 of them. I don't remember the number. It's 684, I think, is the actual number. So General Perna and I sat there and said, well, you know, we already have pretty full warehouses. If I keep transitioning stuff to you, number one, the sustainment budget's gonna go up and eat all of the development budget. And number two, the warehouses are gonna get full, and I already have enough warehouses, so let's see what we gotta do, and we're developing a transition to divestiture program. And in the transition to divestiture, we have a large number of pieces of equipment which we have, but there's no expected purpose for it. We have large supplies of repair parts for pieces of equipment we don't expect to do any modernization or upgrades to. And so what we're currently doing is putting together our divestiture policy and plan to basically scrub through, just like we did for the 1,200 programs, to scrub through all the rest of our materials and try and determine what can we divest of, get out of the system, no longer maintain, and move forward. So that's a basic divestiture. One of the best things we can do in to avoid having to divest is in fact doing that. Don't buy things we don't need. This goes back to my discussion about the transmissions and why it's so important to me that the industrial base starts to push us in how they believe we could maintain our ability to keep things operational in the field in a timely manner, even in a highly contested environment, without having to have a mountain of stuff back here. And so we're looking at, in fact, trying to develop some specific methodologies and technologies necessarily in that arena.
Thanks. And now we looking towards the future a little bit for General Murray and maybe Dr. Jetty too. Do you see what do you see as the future of the cross-functional teams? Do you see a need for additional CFTs? Will the current CFTs work themselves out of a job? And as multi-domain operations becomes more of a joint doctrine, would we create more joint program offices in order to manage? That's probably for you, the JPO stuff.
Yeah, I'm going to leave the joint program offices all to Dr. Jetty.
Yeah.
So one of the fundamental things that I think we've come to realize over the past year is that institutionally the Army has to change, and I've called it various things over the last year, but the current term is a persistently modernizing organization. And so, you know, we're in a hole right now, and that's really the reason, and there's lots of reasons we're in a hole from Army Futures Command. But, you know, what I don't want to do is modernize here in the near term and find ourselves in a hole again in 30 years. And so the role of Army Futures Command I don't think ever goes away, because when MDO becomes a piece of doctrine and it gets turned into doctrine, by our history, we'll need another doctrine in 20 or 30 years. And so we will move on to determine what comes after multi-domain operations, when and if it becomes doctrine. When the cross-functional teams field a piece of material, I mean, we'll move on to something else. And so whether the 8 cross-functional teams, the 6 modernization priorities remain that for forever, probably not forever. Near term, absolutely. The 8 cross-functional teams are the 8 cross-functional teams, and we're addressing things through other mechanisms. For instance, the ISR task force run by the Army G2. The 6 Army modernization priorities will not change in the near term, but the goal of the cross-functional teams, and I don't ever see them working themselves out of a job, it's what comes next. Once we start to we collectively begin to field a piece of equipment and roll it out to the field, we have got to be forward-thinking enough. And so, you know, I used to play a trick with my kids all the time. Is they'd ask me for something, I'd tell them tomorrow, and they'd talk to me tomorrow, and I'd say it's not tomorrow, it's today. And so in many ways, tomorrow continues to advance. And so how do you keep looking, be agile enough to keep looking into the future to make sure that tomorrow never sneaks up on you and you are in a position where you're competitive for that future?
And did you want to talk at all about JPOs?
Yeah, so I'll give you a quick update on JPO perspective. So this is my personal opinion. I don't see JP joint program offices as significantly fruitful. If you look back at the history of them, they've been established more out of political desire than they and ethereal concepts that if only we bring everybody together and sing songs, we'll get the best answer. And what really ends up happening is everybody gets together and they all wrestle over what they think is they should be in charge of. And I mean, look, UAVs were a prime example. We had a UAV program. It was an Army program. We decided, OSDs decided it was going to be this is years ago, so I'm not blaming anybody that's probably even alive. And we made a joint program office out of it, and I think we went 15 years without producing a UAV. And then the Army broke free of it and said, I'm going to go do my own UAV, and boom, they had UAVs. So you can end up with the UAV that will do everything except nobody can make it, so therefore it does nothing. So when we do joint program offices, I believe that you have to really be careful about whether or not it actually is a good solution to the problem. There are we have two joint program offices in the Army, JPEO Ammunition and Armaments, and JPEO CBNRD. I was hoping we could find a way to put a vowel in there, but we didn't. So chemical, biological, nuclear, radiological defense. They work fairly well as a joint office, but I think it's mostly because they're about 90% of what they do is mostly focused from a ground perspective on Army things, which actually happen to work for the Air Force and the Navy and the Marines in their roles. And we bring in things. So it's in truth more along not joint but service-led. And in several of the programs and things that we've been doing with OSD and the other services right now, I think that we're all sort of kind of more inclined to work at a service-led approach as opposed to a joint program office.
So with that, let me ask Neil Thurgood to chime in about the memorandum of agreement and hypersonics and how that's organized.
Yeah, thanks. So in the hypersonics domain, there's this construct, this need started at an OSD level and was funded through the Defense-wide account. And in order for the services to come together and formulate a cohesive strategy, there was a memorandum of agreement put in place which defined very specific roles and responsibilities. So I think anytime you have a joint office or you have a relationship, you have to define where there are clear boundaries. At the same time, you have to have flexibility in where those boundaries can be changed over time, right? When you are trying to do things fast, you have to be flexible enough to not own a permanent structure that you cannot change, right? Things change quickly, so you have to be able to be flexible. A memorandum of agreement allows that to happen. In the case of hypersonics, you have a land component, a sea component, an air component, and a defensive component, and each of the services have a role in that component. And it's not a joint program office, it's a joint effort, right? So as was just mentioned by Arnold Jetty, the services each have a domain that they're responsible for. And this, at the 3-star level, we meet, so myself for the Army, Vice Admiral Wolf; for the Navy, Duke Richardson, Lieutenant General Duke Richardson; for the Air Force, and Vice Admiral Hill for the Missile Defense Agency. And we collectively decide the changes that are going to happen with everything that's common. So across those 4 domains, those 4 pillars inside of our MOA, we share the common hypersonic glide body. And so in our MOA, the Navy owns the design responsibilities. In other words, they have to figure out collectively and have to use the board of directors to collectively determine how we're going to go forward. And then they have to put a material strategy together to go forward, whatever block 2, block 3, block 4, whatever is going to come forward. In that same MOA, the Army owns the production responsibility. So the Army owns the responsibility to produce an industrial base that can take something out of the labs and commercially produce this in large numbers. if you don't have those agreements in place, imagine how difficult it would be if the idea was just this group designs it and throws it over the wall and this group produces it. That would almost be an impossibility. It would almost never work. And so this collective board of directors that we operate under allows those decisions to get made and balanced across the common elements. A subset of that is the Navy and the Army share a common booster stack. And so there are no independent decisions that get made on the booster stack, not on the Army side, not on the Navy side. There are no independent decisions that get made on glide body design and how we're going to produce glide bodies. Even though the Army is responsible to produce them, and we have a very detailed list of every glide body we're going to produce and where it goes and what its outcome is for and who's going to use it, so that we synchronize the individual priorities of effort with the national priorities of effort to meet the national defense strategy, produce the outcome in the relevant time that we need a national capability. Sometimes we've used MOAs as a mechanism to help make hard decisions. That's not really the appropriate use of an MOA. A governance structure helps you make hard decisions. The MOA is just a mechanism to say we agree we're going to have a governance structure, because you can't ever write an MOA with sufficient detail that's going to cover every outcome and every possible solution to every branch and sequel that's going to come over time. And when you enter into that MOA process, if you realize that there's a series of trays that have to happen and a series of outcomes that are not negotiable in everybody's pillar, right? Getting to a battery in 23 is not negotiable. That is the outcome. And so when you have the clarity of each of the pillars, the MOA governance helps us in that trade-off process. Very different than a joint program that Honorable Jetty was speaking of, where you're actually trying to produce a joint outcome and you're going to use it in different services. That's different than a memorandum of agreement, which allows for individual outcomes, even though there's some collective parts to that outcome.
Thanks, Neil. And to Dr. Shadlow, and then anybody who wants to chime in on the subject of intellectual property and the challenge that it poses to us to maintain our intellectual property when we have adversaries who are actively trying to steal it away from us, and then to protect it within the government contracting process, and while at the same time sharing it openly enough to be innovative and rapid. So we'll start with you, Nadia, if you want to talk about the threat out there.
Yeah, and then I think it's also very relevant to General Murray's point about cooperating with universities, labs, and also I'd be interested in Gwen's comments on it. And I think over the past 2 years, the issue has been raised at a national level. So the first step in addressing that problem is making everyone aware that it exists, and I think that's been done very effectively over the past 2 years. The U.S. Trade Representative did a big 301, I think it's called the 301 report in March of 2017, I think, which is very detailed. DIU published a report in DOD, but the Defense Innovation Unit in earlier this year also on China's tech transfer strategy and the way it uses investments as part of its IP exfiltration. So I think the first step has been making this, making the nation aware of the problem. That's the first step. Second, I think DOD is actually making it now much more of a requirement that industry think about this as well, thinking about supply chain issues, IP, making it a part of the contracting process. And although I'm not pro-regulation in any way, in this case, addressing this as a key part of the process is important. I mean, it adds a burden on industry, but it's an important part of it. We still have issues in, I think, getting the universities to think about this. Generally, they're open academic environments. That's the way universities work. But thinking through this, I think, probably needs to be more of a requirement where, especially where DOD money is going, but overall. But, I think the fact that we're having this national conversation is a big step. And I think it's important to add in this, there's bipartisan support for addressing this in a more holistic way, and that's important too.
And let me just, before we bring it to this end of the table, Gwen, what are your concerns on IP dealing with government contracts?
I think the government gets ripped off, that you pay 99% of the bill, or when you pay 99% of the bill, and contractors put in 1 or 1.5% of IRAD, and then they own the IP. That makes 0 sense to me. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Mike or Dr. Jetty? Or Dr. Jetty?
I agree with Gwen.
So IP is one of my favorite topics. We have another hour to talk on IP. I have IP. I have patents. I know the difference between patents, trade secrets, and copyrights. And when you kind of get asked if you'd come do something like this, well, I think most of us that do get asked, we sit at our computer at one point and say, you know what are the top 10 things I hope to get accomplished when I get into the position? One of the top 10, in fact, quite close to the number one. Number one actually is talent management and development for my workforce. But number 2 on my list was IP. It turns out IP, as challenging it is a little easier than the first. So the Army announced earlier this year an IP policy. The policy is relatively small, but there's a large, much like General Murray was talking about the modernization strategy. The policy is like the strategy, and then we have an implementation guidance that's I think 250 or so pages. I think that they've just kind of picked. We're going to fit strategy implementations and policy implementations into 250 pages. So we have an IP policy. We have an IP a strategy for implementation, and it goes much to Gwen's point. I was on the outside. I dealt with the government. I've dealt with commercial industry. In the government, generally we don't know how to deal with IP. It's like this ethereal thing in the background, but everything's mine. Everything's open. I can have everything. And the problem with that is, no, you're not a 3-year-old. It's not all yours. Some other people invested real money on their part, real time, real thought. Particularly your small companies. We talked earlier about small companies. Small companies don't have campuses full of buildings and large facilities. What's of value in their world, what they can leverage, is their intellectual property for the most part. So if we don't respect the IP that's developed by and at the expense of our business partners, then what we end up doing is we're essentially stealing from them. And what we're also doing, particularly for the small companies, is driving them away, because all you have to do is rip me off once and I'm never coming back to you. You mean I gave you a PowerPoint presentation, you put it on the internet? Okay, in my position, I've actually done 2 15-6 investigations on basically that very thing, because I honor the people who invest in developing IP and then bringing it to the Army as a potential capable application. Conversely, to Gwen's point, you bring me in a little bitty thing, and then I've got, here's one of that, but what I needed was a bucket of water, and so I end up developing the bucket and filling the bucket up, but you say it's your bucket because you put the first bottle of water in. No, I spent a lot of time doing commercial application of engineering and development. If you pay me to do something, you own it. Now, occasionally we got that right, and we would say, oh yeah, well, if you pay me, I'm paying you, therefore I own the IP. What we never did, that all commercial industry does, is owning it means I have it. It's mine, it's in my hands. I can use it, I can leverage it. So we wrote a policy that honors both of us. It honors those who spent their money to develop a technology and IP, and those who got paid and who actually pay for it are taxpayers. So if you developed it and we're gonna use it, we're gonna make sure that we've got payment to you appropriate to whatever technology it is. If the taxpayer paid for it, the Army's gonna own it, and the Army's going to have possession of it. Now, how do we implement that? We have a, in the implementing guidance, we put this into the way that we're doing contracting, particularly for medium and large contracts. In the pricing volume, this is how commercial industry does it. If I want to come in and bid on a project for commercial industry and I want to weave my technology into it, I have to tell the commercial technology what the value of my technology, the commercial industry, the value of my technology into their project. So I have to identify what I believe is proprietary technology. Is it covered by a patent or a trade secret? If it's mine, what am I going to charge for it? Okay, so put your price on there, not just your close-in price, but your long-term price. If software is always the easiest one to describe, you got a copyright on a piece of software. I want to put it into the system. That's great. How much is it going to cost me? It is proprietary. It's yours. You retain ownership of it. I recognize that. What's my licensing fee? Within that licensing fee, who's maintaining the software? If you're charging me a licensing fee and I'm maintaining the software, then we're going to have a different discussion about the licensing fee than if you're maintaining the software. That way, if somebody bids $100,000 for a product and includes all the IP, I got a way to compare it in the long term versus somebody who bids $75,000 for a product but charges me for all sorts of IP rights. I can look long term what it's going to cost the Army and then make a more coherent decision. It may well be that the $100,000 item is much less expensive in the long run than is a $75,000 item because of this IP. And this has been buried in the fact that we don't pay attention to intellectual property and property rights. I also believe that there's one last twist to this. If we're going to do what we were talking about, advanced manufacturing capability, we're going to remove a bunch of the logistics tails and warehouses and mountains full of stuff that becomes obsolete, then we're going to have an ability to produce these items in relatively short periods of time using the more and more advanced equipment as it comes along. But I don't want to take industry's investment in their technology. So if you invented a doohickey and we want to produce a doohickey and we've got a license and we accepted that doohickey as part of it, then the license goes out and you say, well, yeah, but I want to produce it and then I want to put it in a bag and we'll ship it from point A to point B and maybe we make a pile of them. How about we just put the licensing fee into letting us produce it at the front end? So now I've got a forward support battalion. They download the file, they push the button, per chunk, out comes the doohickey, and a check shows up just like royalties for TV commercials and those type of things. Just think of that. Isn't this a good idea, guys? You the industry guys, you're just sitting there, you're home, a check shows up in the mail because some guy in Poland just printed out one of your doohickeys, you know, and you didn't have to do anything. You got a profit out of the deal. So I think there's a lot of things we can do just by simply not ignoring IP and getting it straight within each other's.
If I could add to that. So the first thing is you're my new best friend. I love that construct. I think there's a balance that happens between where the government is involved in building an industrial base, like I mentioned earlier, where we're putting money into an outcome that doesn't currently exist, and who gets to drive that outcome, and who gets to own the results of that outcome, versus the second piece of that, which is there's an existing industrial base, and they have a thing that they put their investment in, and that thing is now available for an output to a soldier to use in combat. And then the third piece is a company that is we're trying to discover an output, an innovative idea. In most cases, those are not exactly what we want, but it's pretty close, and we may take it and modify it to a thing we want where we share the intellectual output and the intellectual income. that's tied to the idea that General Murray talked about is when we're out at a company or we're bringing soldiers to increase the soldier touch points, and so that we use this soldier-centered design construct, then we're helping in that process of what that output becomes. That's a shared intellectual property outcome. And so there's this balance that has to happen as we make those agreements and make those arrangements up front in the process. And particularly in the prototyping world, the only really rule we have in the prototyping world in terms of design is don't build brick walls to the future. Don't design something so poorly in a prototype that it can't be modified for a future outcome. By definition, it's going to be modified. That's why it's called a prototype. And the sharing of that is a balance that gets negotiated at the upfront piece. At the delivery point with the soldier, who by the way doesn't care about any of this argument, it is not the time to have that conversation because it gets there's too much emotional discharge associated with it. And so you have to have those agreements up front based on a mutual understanding of where that basis happened in the process.
Thanks. Okay, so unfortunately, we have enough questions here that we were unable to get to fill another 2-hour session easily. So for all of you who submitted questions that we didn't get to, I apologize for that, but thank you. And thank all of you for attending, and especially thank you to our panelists for your time and insights for what I think was a very informative discussion. So thanks, everybody.
Okay, good.
You stayed awake, guys.
I tried. How about you?